I'm talking here with John F. Schuessler from the NASA Shuttle project. John is employed by McDonnell Douglas Technical Services. He is the Space Flight Operations project manager for them on the Space Shuttle. He is an aerospace engineer and a UFO researcher. John, welcome to Australia.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure being here.
I understand since your visit here that you've decided to look at migrating.
That would be a fun thing to do.
John's even found that he has relatives here in Sydney, I think it is.
It's amazing where you find relatives and friends and contacts. And
now, if you could you give us a brief rundown on your credentials, where you studied, and then get into where you work?
Yes, my background is basically engineering. I've worked in the space program since 1962, beginning with the Mercury space program, working into Gemini, Skylab, Apollo-Soyuz, and now the shuttle program. My basic training is mechanical engineering that I obtained through U.S. Naval schools when I was in the Navy. And I followed that up with degree study in psychology and in management, and later in-depth study of future technology in a future studies program, which I now use to, you might say, predict what's going to happen.
Came out in a conversation with you a couple of days ago that you had been responsible for the design of the tanks in the Skylab that fell to Australia. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, that was a very interesting situation. A lot of people expressed a lot of fear because those big oxygen tanks that were actually a filament wound tank covering a small skin of stainless steel carried oxygen at 3,000 pounds pressure. We defined those during the program for a couple of reasons. One, they were light, they were strong, they were less expensive than conventional kinds. And I'd like to say that I'm kind of happy that I was involved in the design of that, even though they fell on Australia, because had I not, the tanks that would have fallen would have been twice as heavy, twice as strong, and would have probably done more damage.
Yes, they probably would have fallen in a different location for sure.
A different location, and they definitely would not have burned up.
After the event occurred on Skylab, the NASA people sent down, I think, a guy named Gray, Mr. Gray, or maybe it was the American government, to head up the investigation and pick up the pieces. Do you know anything about the recovery of the heavier elements that went further into the country, or did you just hear about the light tanks?
I know very little about the other pieces of it. I did talk to the people on the recovery team afterwards, and some of the things they received, heat exchangers and pieces of material that were fairly dense, so they didn't burn up. The oxygen tank in particular, though, was my real interest because it was such a breakthrough in technology at the time to be able to do that. And that particular tank that was picked up is on display at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama now for everyone to see, and saying that that was picked up in Australia.
John, can you tell us a bit about what the crew does in the shuttlecraft when they're in orbit? I mean the things that aren't censored, of course. Not the pranks, just the real work.
Not the pranks. Well, the crew working on orbit is much like you and I working in our offices or our laboratories. An astronaut can do anything in space they can do on the ground. Sometimes, and actually it's much easier. Other times they require special tools or special devices to hold them in place. So being in orbit is not really that mysterious any longer. In the early days, people were worried you couldn't stay alive and you would decalcify, or your heart muscle would get tired and quit. All sorts of worries that really didn't pan out. We found now that a shuttle astronaut, for instance, can stay on orbit 7 days with very little degradation of body functions. A simple 15-minute per day period of exercise on a small treadmill is sufficient to keep the heart muscles properly activated and without degradation. I think you can compare it with being ill and having to have bed rest. If you don't exercise some small amount, you become weaker and weaker. A very little amount of exercise brings your body tone, your muscle tone all back.
What causes the calcium to be consumed by the body?
I really couldn't tell you exactly what the mechanism of that is. I'm not a medical person. The body does a lot of things on orbit, though, that I'm aware of. You have a fluid balance situation. In Earth, 1G gravity, where your whole body is being pulled downward. Your body fluids tend to pool at the bottom of your body, and your heart's pumping your blood up, and your other systems are trying to get the fluids distributed properly. In space, that all equalizes out. Since there's no pull on the body, everything balances in such a way that your body shape changes. If you happen to have a long, thin face on Earth, when on orbit, your face will get shorter and plumper.
What a way to do a
Yeah.
facelift, huh?
It's a terrific facelift. If you're a short person, you will become taller because the gravity pull in your spine that collapses all the vertebrae down in Earth environment, on space, that relaxes and you become an inch or two taller. And,
Fascinating.
It's amazing the differences that occur, but the body recuperates from that very rapidly. After landing, within hours, your body's back to the same shape it was before.
Well, why was it that a few of the Russian cosmonauts couldn't even get out of their chairs, you know, on the landings that they made? We saw photographs of them still sitting in a chair because their physical condition was such that they couldn't get up.
Well, a number of us have the personal feeling that the Russians didn't have the discipline that our astronauts had. We literally schedule our astronauts through everything. We tell them when to do everything they have to do, from going to the bathroom to eating to sleeping to running the cameras to activating emergency equipment to housekeeping duties. Each person on board a spacecraft has his own timeline, as we call it, a listing of events minute by minute, day by day. We tell them when to go to sleep, when to wake up, how much recreation period they have, when they should exercise, the type of exercise. And the Russians seem to have more of a laissez-faire attitude. Yep, they're in space and they have some work to do, and their systems are much more crude. They don't have a treadmill, or didn't earlier at least, have a treadmill to exercise on. And it's very easy to get lackadaisical in space and say, oh, this is so comfortable, why should I work and why should I exercise? And your body is going to detone. And if you consider the Russians stayed on orbit longer than anyone else has, a tremendously long period of time. If we were to increase our flight from 7 days to 30 days, for instance, we would no longer stick with a 15-minute regimen of exercise. We would increase that significantly. And we would probably change the types of exercise, the way you go about it, the different muscles that you would be trying to maintain. So I guess it is discipline is more than anything, and planning.
Well, a lot of the problems that you are mentioning there are functions of a lack of gravity. Now, if we have ways to spin the craft, or perhaps electrical means to simulate gravity later, wouldn't that solve the problem?
Well, that will solve the problem. Even a small amount of gravity makes a big difference.
The space station you're going to put up?
The space station, our early space stations will probably be simple platforms and will not have a spinning area. Later space stations will have a portion that will spin and give a gravity area. But early space stations should not be spun up. And I say that for one reason. The reason for putting a space station up is for experimentation, to be able to develop metals, pharmaceuticals, and other things that you want to take advantage of zero gravity. If you spin it up and have gravity, you might as well stay on the ground. You ruin the process. So you must maintain a laboratory condition where you have no gravity conditions, and you can do the many things that space offers that you can't get anywhere else. You can't possibly duplicate. For living conditions, however, you would like to have a chamber or a segment of a space station that spins up. Now, in the great distant future, 30 to 50 years hence, when we get very large stations with 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 1 million people, or whatever, those are actual colonies. Those will probably have a large spun-up environment, maybe the total thing, with a center core that's zero gravity. And the center core may not be used as much for experimentation as it will for weekend sporting. Instead of going skiing, you go zero gravity diving or something of that nature. But that's downstream a ways, and we first have to lick the early problems of convincing people we should be in space to manufacture things.
John, you mentioned something earlier about the toilet. You even tell them when to go to the toilet. I know it's a rather seldom discussed subject, but how do astronauts use the toilet?
Well, it's very much like you use a toilet on Earth. In the past, the early programs, astronauts had to use a baggie, some sort of a plastic bag with a closable top, and they would contain their waste material in that and then tie it up and put it in a little chamber, a waste compartment or something. In the days of the Skylab, they devised a facility with a toilet, which was literally on the wall of the spacecraft. And they would have to strap themselves against the wall. Of course, in zero gravity, you really don't care. It could be on the ceiling. Now for the space shuttle, we have a very fancy toilet. It's a device that looks very much like a toilet on the ground, except you must have stirrups to put your feet in so you can hold yourself down, and a seat belt to connect yourself up. But the purpose of a toilet in space now is to make the living as simple as possible, so you don't have to go through all of the problems of baggies and the dirt and the odors and things like that. So once an astronaut sits on the toilet seat, they activate an airflow that draws air in from the cabin through the toilet, and it keeps everything flowing inward. That airflow goes through a filter and eventually comes back out into the cabin and is reused, recirculated, and the filter takes the odor out of it. But the airflow carries the waste material down into the toilet basin, and we have a spinner in there, sort of like a fan blade of some type. It's called a slinger, and when activated, this slinger has tines that open out, and they spin around like that. The waste material hits the slinger, and it literally cuts it up and pastes it to the outside of the toilet, the outside perimeter. Then when the astronaut completes his duty, he closes this whole device off and activates a vacuum chamber, and it vacuum dries the material. And of course, that takes the odor and kills the bacteria or puts it in a dormant state. And very useful, easy way of handling it. You don't have to worry about gravity.
What, do you just shove it out the spacecraft door, or do you?
No, it's actually left in there, and some poor guy has to come along when the vehicle lands and clean up the toilet.
Well, being an old Air Force boy, I know that when we had navigation flights, if you were the one that used the honeypot, you emptied it when you hit the ground. So everybody was usually bursting by the time they hit the ground.
I can imagine. I think it's interesting to consider a little more about the shuttle.
All right.
You know, it's viewed by many people as being a very fantastic high-technology device, when in fact it's using technology that was devised during the earlier space programs. The main new developments for the space shuttle were just enlarging the size of the solid rocket boosters to make them the largest that's ever been flown. And the solid rocket boosters are used for only 2 minutes during the flight, but they lift this huge, heavy-weighted object off the ground and gets it on its way to orbit. And then the main engines take over, and they burn liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen mixed together. Again, that's not new technology. It's old technology. The main thing new there is that the engines are very high-performance engines. And so that was an evolution in space technology. The shuttle itself is operated by 5 major computers. It's a computer-operated device. It could operate without the astronaut in the loop, literally, perform all its own housekeeping functions and the like to stay healthy. But that would be kind of useless, because the astronaut can do things that the computer can't. When something appears to go wrong, the computer can switch to something else. The computer can give all kinds of signals and warnings and that sort of thing. But the astronaut can examine the evidence and say, well, that's really no problem. We're just going to bypass that and go on to something else. So putting an astronaut into space with a machine is probably the thing that's going to lead us into the future here on Earth. We are, growing so rapidly that we need a place to expand. And we need to view space as the place that we should be going, is my opinion at least. And we should not think it as voodooism or superstition or anything else that's behind these machines. They're very simple devices. They're just large aircraft that are built for a different purpose. And they don't have wild, crazy Star Wars type devices on them at all. It's really, the shuttle is just a space truck. And it hauls things up there and dumps it out, comes back and gets another load. And most people don't realize that. They think that there's something very exotic behind it and something very mysterious. It's just that it's a complicated conglomerate of a lot of little systems. That's the main difficult problem involved.
Can you give us a bit of information about the Getaway project?
The Getaway Special Project is a special program defined by NASA headquarters to allow people that normally wouldn't use the space shuttle, normally not be able to afford to use it, to actually put an experiment aboard. They utilize a small canister that hangs on the side of the wall out in the payload bay of the space shuttle, and they sell that space to anyone that wants to buy it. It can be a student in a high school or a college group or a corporation, an individual, an author, a TV station. It really doesn't matter.
You mean, sorry, you mean, in other words, it doesn't have to really be a super experiment. You could just buy space on the shuttle?
It can be anything. You're buying space, essentially. The device that you put in that canister, though, must have certain limitations. It must not be dangerous to the space shuttle. You wouldn't want to put a device in that had an explosive characteristic, for instance. It might damage the whole system. Also, if you wish to have a device that takes its own pictures, in other words, has a TV camera or a movie camera or something in it, you need to furnish that and need to furnish a timing device that would shut it off and do the things you need in that manner. Essentially, the astronauts will go flip a switch and say, you know, your Getaway Special is operating, and it must be self-sustaining after that. But there are a lot of fine things you can do with that. There will be an experiment aboard a flight very soon that will make snow. In other words, what is the formation of a snow crystal? How is it done? And these people decided they wanted to know. So they're going to make snow crystals in space and examine the perfection of the crystal and structure, how it's generated. That can be used possibly downstream in the future in controlling weather conditions, bad blizzard conditions, on understanding the formation of the snowflake itself. Another outfit is using the Getaway Special to put seeds into space. A seed company in the United States that provides vegetable seeds for vegetable gardens and flowers and that for the general public had decided that sometime we're going to have a space station that needs to grow plants. And so the president of this company said, I'm going to buy space and put packages of seeds on that vehicle and determine what space exposure does to the seeds. And at the same time, I'll have some seeds back home that we use as a control element. And after the flight, after exposure of various levels of cosmic energy, and some to vacuum, some not, we'll grow all the seeds and see what the differences are, see if there are mutations, see if some seeds are better performers in space than others, and then when it comes time to build a space station where you need foodstuffs, we'll be ready. And that's a meritorious type thing to do. In some cases, student groups will put something on to determine how a water drop is formed, or how you can melt a piece of metal and get a different kind of structure to it, or maybe a mixture of metals, or whatever your imagination can come up with. You can come up with an experiment for a Getaway Special.
The two obvious questions. One, how much does it cost? And two, what's the booking time?
Cost is very, very minimal. The smallest size package at this time is about $3,000. You can run up to a larger package, and it costs you up to $10,000. Even that is very reasonable for going into space.
Yeah, well, I would think so, yes.
Very, very reasonable for going up there. The booking time, however, is a little more tough. It may take you at least 2 years to get on at this point in time. That's not bad, however, because it'll probably take you 2 years to define and design and refine your equipment so that you'll really get a payoff out of your experiments. You wouldn't want to hastily put something together and throw it up there and then it doesn't work and then you spent your $3,000 or $10,000 for nothing. So,
can like say a TV channel or something wanted to do it as a publicity gimmick, could they contact a company that already has television cameras deep space tested and just use something like that with some film footage? Could they do that?
Well, remember, this canister is a closed seal can.
There's no openings.
And there's no openings. You're not going to spot something out in space from it. It's a self-contained unit. When you load it aboard the shuttle, you slam the door, literally. You close it up, seal it off, make the connections necessary for electrical actuation or whatever, and then after the shuttle lands, it's removed and given back to you. And you have your results. And if you're going to put a camera there, it has to be something that's small, low power, and have your own battery supply, et cetera.
John, as a future technologist, have you been doing studies on other methods of propelling space vehicles rather than a brute force type device?
Well, as a future technologist, I've been doing a lot of things. So one of the many things falls into that category. It's difficult to work in the space program and not want to expand that knowledge base outside the space program. And so when I go home at night, quite often I'll have one of those aha situations. Why didn't I think of doing this? And it starts another whole new chain of thought. And I'm interested in the future of weaponry in space, whether or not we need it or we're going to have it. I'm interested in the economics of the future. will we be able to sustain a society so we can have space, for instance? And most of the things that I do come back to space because I think that's where the future is. We have to live on Earth right now. We have to learn to get along with each other, which we apparently haven't done too well yet, but we will. So future technology is what you want to make it. A futurist, by design, is not a person that makes wild guesses and not a person that has a psychic ability that says, I foresee that on May 27th so-and-so is going to happen. A futurist, rather, is a person that uses the information that's available to them on what is happening now and then looks at trend data, extrapolates the technology, looks at possible breakthroughs. Many futurists are very pessimistic, and all of their projections are made as what is known as surprise-free projections. In other words, nothing different is going to happen as has already happened. So whatever the future will just be more of this. In other words, if the financial situation is bad, it's going to get worse. If the population is large, it's going to get larger. And to me, that's a foolish approach. If you look at the historical perspective, everything that has been a prime driver in the future has been devised by doing something different, not by doing something larger, faster, or stronger, but by doing it in a different way. I guess going to the modern day electronics and getting rid of the vacuum tube was probably one of the greatest future things that happened. People that predicted you couldn't do certain things didn't foresee that breakthrough. And it's that way in many fields. The computer technology we have today, each year a person buys a home computer, they say that's the greatest and the latest and the fanciest, and before they get their programs in it, it's already obsolete because someone else has done it better. And quite often, again, differently. New high-speed chips and all. So the future is really impossible to predict, but it is tremendously possible to affect and to influence. And that's what a futurist tries to do. A futurist tries to devise the various ways that you can go about influencing the future and then strive to make that happen.
Well, how, when you say influence the future, if you're just sitting behind a desk and writing this stuff down or maybe an article here and there, how do you affect the future? I mean, who do you go to say this needs to be done, do it?
Well, some people go nowhere, unfortunately. My approach is to communicate profusely with people across the globe. You look for patterns of events that are taking place. You do that by reading the various magazines, newspapers, checking television programs, and things that come from various countries, in addition to your own country. Look to see which individual in that country or countries, the area, has an interest that appears to border on what yours is, or maybe completely the opposite. And then communicate with that person and try to understand what it is. And quite often the synergistic effect of more than one person working together on an idea extrapolates. So they add a little, you add a little, and you keep building and you come up with a whole new thing. You cannot do it by staying isolated and alone. That is virtually impossible. All you do is influence your own future in that.
So what you would be aiming at really is more than influencing, say, political figures, you would be influencing the great database of the general people.
I think that's it in a nutshell. I am not a political type person. I have no real interest in trying to convince a politician in any country, any time period, to do something in particular. I'm basically a technologist. I like to see new things happen. I like to see devices change that can help mankind. I like to see people accept those devices and start using them. One of the best examples of that that I can see is the computer. Again, going back to the computer. In the past 10 years in the United States, computer technology has changed tremendously. Now, we've always used computers in the space program, but very few people used them at home because they were large, expensive, complicated. The programming was difficult. And in the last 10 years, there's been a complete innovation in that there are a number of companies manufacturing home computers. The older people looking at that says, what am I going to use that for? That's a frightening device. The young people, the children, take one look at it and say, well, how does this work? And if I punch this, what does this do? And if I put this kind of program in, what can I get out? And, oh, you have this program? Let me look at the program and see what I can do to change it. And the young people have absolutely no fear of the computer. It's just a natural tool, like using a frying pan in the kitchen, or
Does your daughter have one?
automobile. Or
Does your daughter have one?
my daughter uses, I have an IBM home computer, and my daughter uses it quite often. In fact, I at times have the joke around the house, I have to schedule time on my own computer.
Very good. John, would you think that there would be a number of other invisible colleges working in this area like your own around the planet?
Yes, I think that's unfortunately necessary. The scientific community in general is a very biased community. And if something hasn't been done and publicly demonstrated, it's impossible. That seems to be the outlook of the scientific community. And I'd like to term that as the old not invented here syndrome. If I didn't invent it, it can't be invented. And you'll find that scientists in general, the most brilliant ones that have the most brilliant inventions to their credit, are usually the people that the first to say, well, that can't be done, the new idea can't be done, especially if it's outside their particular field. And that's a kind of a sorry situation. So whenever a scientist comes along that's a little more of a rebel, so to say, that really thinks it can be done, instead of publicly admitting it and doing a paper for a noted journal, they again look for people that have similar ideas, as I mentioned earlier, and they communicate with them, and they form what is called an invisible college. And their names are not used externally to the press or the public, but these people work together to devise these new concepts and new ideas. And once they're refined, sometimes taking 1 year, other times 25 years, eventually it becomes public. Sometimes information leaks out that they're doing it, and their peers then put them down, literally destroy them for it, and the idea never gets out. And
would you say that the Club of Rome is a rather large semi-invisible college?
the Club of Rome per se is a visible college in a way. And the Club of Rome has sponsored a number of studies, which I call doomsday studies, because essentially what they've said is, you know, you've got to stop expanding, you've got to stop technology development, you've got to stop consuming, you've got to stop pollution. And if you don't, we are going to expend everything we have on Earth, and we can no longer live here. You come to a time of total collapse, and that time is in the very near future. Thomas Malthus in 1798 was the first Club of Romer, as far as I'm concerned, because Thomas Malthus predicted that the population growth would outstrip the capability to produce food in this world within a very short period of time. 1798, he was wrong. He didn't foresee the changes. He didn't see doing things differently. He didn't see that we could hybrid our plants and make them produce more, make them produce higher value foods. He didn't foresee the fertilizer industry, and one can go on and on and on. The next thing you're going to see is gene splicing in plants that will produce plants that are resistant to blights, to bugs, plants that can produce, say, an ear of corn with much greater productivity of corn per kernel, much more powerful kernels of corn, maybe even larger plants that can produce much more per plant. And these things, again, were not factored into the Club of Rome studies. The Club of Rome study was, in my view, a very biased viewpoint. Now, it's not all bad. I'm not saying that you shouldn't look at this negative structure of things, because it does make you go back and reevaluate your position. If we, for instance, said that pollution, yeah, it's there and we've got to put up with it, and we're never going to address the subject, and nobody gave us a hard time about it, it would be economically cheaper to let the pollution reside in our atmospheres, over our cities, and in our rivers. And people like the Club of Rome have done a good job of waving the red flag, so to say, and saying, look, stop, and all that. And we've turned our technology on to correct some of those problems. But again, groups like the Club of Rome don't have all the answers. Being a futurist organization of a nature, although I perceive it as a negative futurist organization, all it can do is predict a possible future, not the future. And by predicting that possible future, it effectively changes it.
Because people react to the prediction.
Because people react.
Would you say now that the world economy, the great flag in the economy, is a result of reaction to the Club of Rome type doctrine?
I think that there's probably a lot of that involved. The world economy situation is even more difficult to describe in a futurist viewpoint than technology is. And being that I don't have much of a background in banking and the like, it's difficult for me to say where it's going. I do view it as a hazardous situation at best, though. For instance, at the present time, third world countries, communist nations, owe Western banks $820 billion, a staggering amount of money. And when you look at the economies in those countries and evaluate the political situation, it's almost guaranteed that they will not repay that debt. In fact, they probably won't even pay the interest on it. Who stands to lose? I would say everyone. The bankers themselves won't take the hit. They will pass it on along to other areas.
To the consumer.
To the consumer. Now, the Club of Rome would have you, I would say that, well, we must stop because of that, right?
Pull in the belt.
Pull in the belt, tighten the belt, go no further, don't give the people any more money, change the way of doing things, tell those people to stop their population growth or else, et cetera. And that's great, but as soon as you do that, you have collapse. And that's the collapse that they're predicting will happen if you don't do it. It's my opinion that you must go forward.
In other words, you could say it like this: the Club of Rome supports a limited growth or no growth scenario.
Growth, essentially.
And there are other groups opposing them with a global model that allows for growth, right?
Yes. It's the old story of the fixed pie. In other words, you have a pie and you can cut it into so many slices and that's all you have. Or you have an expanding pie. You bake several pies. And the adversary group to the Club of Rome is essentially headed by Herman Kahn.
Do they have a name?
Not really. He worked for a think tank. He actually is a major think tank type operator. And for that reason, I think that he has a different kind of a worldview. And I think more in line with Herman Kahn in that where there's a will, there's a way. And by looking at the problems of the present, we can affect the future to make them better without stopping the world and getting off. And it's all well and good for the negative side to say that we must stop population growth, we must stop pollution and all this or else, and we have to do it immediately because it's going to be too late if we don't. That's a beautiful viewpoint to have, but an impossible one to implement. I mean, it virtually is impossible.
I just had a funny thought as you were saying Herman Kahn, because I'd seen a movie, Star Trek, The Revenge of Khan or something, and I thought, the will of Khan, I can see it coming.
Yes.
All right, now, John, both of these type scenarios about a global government are just that. They really are looking at a one world, a global approach to solving Earth.
Yes.
One is, as we said, cutting growth back, limiting it, stopping it, and the other is saying spend, invest, make, grow. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem we have, as I see, we could probably use the Herman Kahn grow pattern from where we are right now, but both of them will have to have a central committee, a person in charge. How do they solve that problem?
I don't believe they do solve that problem. I've read it at length, both viewpoints, and neither one seem to have the answer as far as a global community. There are projections of how to do it by having certain organizations take the lead. There are others that feel it's just going to happen and just evolve. One can say we have the nucleus for that right now if you wanted to accept the United Nations as the baseline to work from for a global government. It really isn't that, though, when you examine it. It's sort of like when we went into space, we devised a one-man spacecraft and we tried it. The United Nations, to me, is that one-man spacecraft. We have a long ways to go. We have to accept that with that, it brings a responsibility of caring for them, for feeding them, for making them work together without destroying each other. You can't do that by legislating it or by having one group say, we're going to enforce this. Some people look at Futurist as having communist leanings, for instance, because so many people view communism as trying to take over the world. My view is just the opposite of that. My view is that you must have a democratic institution doing it. You have to have one where the people can join in from all backgrounds.
If you said that you would not be able to legislate the changes necessary in such a government as this, that really implies a totalitarian or dictatorial structure.
Yeah, legislation does require totalitarian structure, and I don't think totalitarian structure will work. People do not like to be repressed. They don't like to do something because they're told they must, or else, so to say, and backing that with military intervention. You have to create an environment where the people want to do it.
Now that is a thing of major interest, isn't it? Because we're talking now about conditioning the people to want to help the world government.
That's right.
Now, how do you get this global view into the minds of the people in all these countries? How do you reach them?
Actually, I'm a sort of a pessimist in that viewpoint, because there are certain governments on the face of the earth right now that will not allow that discussion to take place within their continental limits. For religious reasons or political reasons or whatever, they don't want their people to think in a global term unless it's their globe and not everybody else is wrong and on the outside. I think it's the only way it can be done, again, goes back to the economy in an economic context. Whatever is done, if it doesn't pay off, it doesn't take hold, it's not accepted. These nations that want to repress others and want to keep their way as the only way of going will not make it, I predict, because they will not be able to sustain the economy.
When you say they won't make it, will they?
They will fail.
They'll be absorbed into
They will be absorbed into something else. They will divide themselves. They will literally destroy themselves. I think an example of that right now is the difficulties that the OPEC community is having. I don't look at the OPEC situation in a futurist context at all, but this was an organization that commanded much power because they controlled the oil flow. And as a result, they controlled a large flow of cash, of dollars, of rubles, or whatever that they were controlling. And that was all well and good for a while. They could set the rules and they could make them stick. At the present time, they're having troubles, and there are people that are forecasting the end of OPEC, so to say, at this point in time. I don't believe that's going to happen. I think that it's going to be a restructuring and a regrouping that's going to go back and find a way to create new shortages of fuel that will again let them operate in a power mode. But I think OPEC's a good example of trying to force it down people's throats. Literally, the term turns people off now, and that's bad. That will not enforce a world government situation.
Well, surely it would lead the way to such a government, because what they're trying to do is going to force the Western nations to lean on them very hard, even with a military presence, to control that situation so that one power bloc cannot do that.
The military presence is another whole ball game too that I think we need to talk about. We're going to see, I believe, an innovation in military technique in the next 20 to 50 years, much the same as in all the rest of this. At the present time, there are nations that feel that individuals are expendable. They can throw as many people onto the line, so to say, as necessary to sustain their way of life, their ism, whatever it is. And that happens for a period of time. But eventually, peoples that become more and more educated and enjoy an improved standard of living rebel and say, hey, I really don't want to go get killed for the cause now. Why don't we find a better way of doing it? Instead of all of us fellows walking over there and shooting each other, why don't we find a way to negotiate it? Or why don't we find a way to set up a system that is not labor intensive? We find our industries have changed so that most of our industries are no longer labor intensive, they're machine intensive. Why not do war the same way? What is the necessity of having many tanks and many ships and thousands or millions of soldiers in various countries? Why not change the complexion of war such that Now this is really speculative thinking, I must admit, but why not do it such that war becomes passé because you have found a way to cooperate on Earth through a couple of things. One, through communications and through education. Going backwards a bit, underdeveloped nations have a very large population growth as long as they have a very low per capita income. As soon as the per capita income reaches some very minimal level, the population growth drops. They quit having babies, or they defer them too much later in life. And as soon as their population growth drops, due to education and improved standard of living, it gets better and better and better and better. And that kills the first stage of the problem, overpopulation.
For war we're talking about.
For the world.
Yep.
And the third world countries are already seeing a drop in population growth. Many of the developed nations, industrialized nations, have zero growth at this point in time. Not because somebody legislated it, but because it became the thing to do, because of the economy, because of the way of living, because people live longer. You no longer have to grow 10 children, so one of them will survive to age 25. You can expect that if you have two, they'll probably both live into age 50, 60, 70 years old. So the development of medicines, of techniques of getting along, the standard of living, the living conditions, all has contributed to a change of thought in that area.